Yeah, yesterday.
This is the Social Factor.
Alright, welcome back everybody to the Social Factor.
Hello. If you think Josh sounds a little quieter than usual, it's because he just woke up.
No, I didn't just wake up from
Were you acting?
what?
Were you acting?
No. No, I was I was on the computer working on something and all of a sudden I got tired, so then I laid back in the chair and shut my eyes and then I fell asleep, so
Yeah. That's alright. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to tattletale on him.
and then David got here and he woke me up.
You know how I did it? I smacked him upside the head.
He didn't touch me at all.
Well, I did actually. I did smack you.
No, you didn't.
Yeah, remember I went like this. So you were still half asleep. Sure.
But yeah,
It was a playful one.
You didn't actually touch me.
No, it was playful. Alright, let's go on with the show.
Yeah. Alright, so today's topic, yesterday. Last week we did the history of North and South Korea.
Yep.
And now we're going to do the history of Russia.
Yeah, Russia.
Russia.
Yep.
Okay. As always, we have our Facebook page. You can go like that on Facebook, facebook.com/The Social Factor Podcast. And then you can chat with us. You don't have to sign up for anything. You can just chat as a guest. Go to our website, which is The Social Factor, hyphen in between each of those words. thesocialfactor.my-free.website, and then click on Listen Live, and you get the chat window there, and you can chat with us and whatnot. So yeah, you can also call into the show.
Hopefully one day that'll happen.
I know, right? Call-in number is 414-949-5778. And I guess without further ado, let's get right into this. The history of Russia. So I'm guessing that you know a lot more about this than I do.
Well,
obviously.
some of it I had to read about. Now, in my family, my grandfather being someone that was originally raised in the Soviet Union, Russia was a big influence. The communist regime of Russia was a very big influence in his youth, you know, until the Nazis arrived, and then the next thing it was like even worse, you know.
Mhm.
So, yeah, and I was raised around a lot of Russian people, and I saw, like, we had because I lived in Germany, in Frankfurt area, there was a lot of embassies, and one of them was the Russian embassy.
Mm-hmm.
So some of those individuals got to meet my grandfather and stuff, and often we had like people from the embassy actually like party with us, you know, was the family. No affiliation to the Communist Party or anything like that. It just my grandfather enjoyed partying, and he made a lot of connections that way. So I was exposed more to the culture than its history. Okay. But I do know a lot about modern Russian history, so I have to look up the stuff that was way before the Soviet Union. Okay, and very interesting history. Like any country, you know, you have these nomad tribes, and then these tribes create villages. Okay, and from there, you ended up having kingdoms, like we discussed with Korea. So Russia kind of went down the same line. The interesting part about Russia is its origin. Now, that region, Russia is a large part of Asia, okay? Like the end, like Siberia and on. And then you go further down, like Middle Asia, Asia Minor, like India and stuff. So you have all these little countries around the major country, which is Russia. And it all started with these few tribes, okay? And I'm going to start start discussing from the 9th century and then forward.
Okay.
And I mean, if you want to talk about its origin, Russia, there's a lot of evidence showing that a portion of the people that originated or settled in that region, two major groups, the Scandinavian tribes, like the Vikings, are a major influence in that region. But even prior to that, there was, believe it or not, the Celtic influence from, like, what we think of today as Ireland. The Celts at one point covered a large region of Western and Eastern Europe. So, but that, of course, they were taken over by other enemy tribes or so. Okay, so just saying that, obviously, you have a nomadic type of environment from the get-go. Okay, so we're gonna start off at the 9th century, and we're gonna start off with the founding of Kievan Rus. Okay, now Kievan Rus is what we know today as modern Ukraine. Okay, that's sort of where it all got its start in. Okay, and the first major East Slavic state. And now the Slavics were, they weren't the Vikings, they weren't the Celts. They actually came from like the Mediterranean and moved up into the Balkans. Okay, and from the Balkans they ended up going into what we know today as Ukraine, and then moved towards what we know today as Russia, parts of it. Okay. And, the traditional account, a matter of debate among historians, attributes its founding to a semi-legendary Viking, or Varangia, how to say it? Varangian leader Oleg, ruler of Novgorod. Novgorod is actually the original area that started what we know today as Moscow. Okay, Moskva is said in Russian.
Probably like the most famous city in Russia.
At the time, this was actually the founding city of what would become Moscow, and then everything worked from it outward from that region. Okay, and so he went on to seize Kiev. Okay, again, Kiev is the capital of modern day Ukraine. All right, and which owning to its strategic location on the, now this is a hard one to say, the Dnieper, I can't even say it, Dnieper, so I think the N is silent, river. So apparently there was a major river that, helped with trade, shipping, and also a lot of like movement for other tribes to take over other tribes. Okay?
Right.
So it was very strategic for this Oleg, and so because of the river, it became the capital of Kievan Rus. Okay, that's what they used to call it. Okay. So then, and I'm only giving key factors of every centuries until we hit about the Bolshevik movement. Okay, which World War I going into that, but we'll get to that in a minute. All right, the 10th century was known as the Rurik dynasty, established and ruled by Prince Vladimir the Great. Now, we're not talking about Dracula here, okay? He was a prince of Volodymyr in Ukraine, herald start of a golden age, so he helped bring them further, bring them to be more successful and more economically sound. Okay. And in 988, Vladimir accepted Orthodox Christianity and begins conversion of Kievan Rus to the Byzantine Rite. Okay, now the Byzantine is actually the original Roman, the last front of the Roman Eastern Empire. Okay, and thus setting the course for Christianity in the East. So he accepts the Orthodox religion, which apparently is a little more Orthodox, meaning a little more traditional. Okay, and one of the first in that area to make it a national or a kingdom religion. Okay, and of course we know that stuff always spreads. Okay, so then in the 11th century, Kievan Rus reaches its peak under Yaroslav the Wise, Grand Prince from 1019 to 1054, with Kiev becoming Eastern Europe's chief political and cultural center. So, and what surprised me is, you have Ukraine, which is kind of this dwarf state, next to this large, gigantic state, country. And here, it turns out that Ukraine actually was the beginning of Russia. And I found that very interesting. I didn't know that at all. So then, from the 11th century into sort of the beginning of the 13th century, there was something called the Mongol domination. Now, you've heard of Genghis Khan.
Yeah. Genghis Khan?
Yeah, and in Genghis Khan, I call him Genghis Khan because that's how we say it where I'm from originally. So it's old habits die hard, And from 1237 through 1240, Mongols invade the Rus principalities, destroying numerous cities and ending Kiev's power. They were also called the Tatars. Okay, the Tatars. It's so hard to say sometimes. As the Mongol invaders became known, established the empire of the Golden Horde. In southern Russia, and the Khan of the Golden Horde becomes overlord of all the Russian princes. Right, and when we think of the Mongols, we think of them as very primitive people.
Right.
They actually were not so primitive, and they collected taxes. They protected their principalities, meaning their territory.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to the Mongols that's questionable, but there were certain principles that they had that were actually fairly modern. You know what I mean?
Right.
For the time. All right, so let's move to the 14th century. Ascendancy of Grand Princes of Moscow under the Mongols. Ivan I is granted the title of Grand Prince after helping to defeat the Tatars uprising in the Principality of Tver, Moscow's great rival. So, this guy actually helped the Mongols to destroy a competitive kingdom. Okay, so that was a little bit of, how would you say, conflict of interest?
Yeah.
Okay, but he got the favor of the Khan himself because he did that. All right, so that was a very smart play by Ivan the First.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're gonna move forward to the 50s. These are all key events that occurred based on their history.
Okay.
And I think part of the reason why otherwise we could be here for 14 hours. I could discuss every century in detail. You know what I mean? So we're gonna move to the 15th century. The Muscovite princes pursue a policy of gathering the Russian lands. Okay, a drive to annex all East Slavic lands. Ivan III the Great subdued most of the great Russian lands by conquest or by the voluntary allegiance of princes. The battle of the Ugra in 1480 marks the end of the Tatar dominance.
Okay.
So, Ivan III expands, and by doing so, ends up kicking out the Mongols. They lose providence.
Right.
Okay. So, going up to the 16th century, from 1547 to 1584, Grand Prince Ivan IV. So, each one of them, I guess, is a title that was within the family. Also known as Ivan the Terrible, is the first ruler to proclaim Tsar in 1547. That's when the name first showed up.
Okay.
And if you translate the Tsar, the word Tsar,
yeah,
it means Caesar.
Okay.
Okay, because that's where the word. Hi everyone.
Oh, you're not live yet.
Okay, that's cool. I'm sorry. I thought I was live. Okay. And the thing about that, which is really interesting, is 1547 was a big year because all of a sudden you changed policies, and Ivan the Terrible actually formed almost like God, what's the word I'm looking for? Aristocracy within his country. So there were families that were actually doing better than others,
Right.
and they were contributing to his political agenda.
By the way, now you're live.
Okay. All right. So now that everybody knows I'm reading this from a script, let's go on. So between 1547 and 84, Ivan the Terrible ruled his reign over the portion of Russia that existed at that time. However, in 1581, 3 years before someone else took his spot, Cossacks began conquering Siberia for Russia. Now, that used to belong to the Mongols, okay? And at some point, a portion of Siberia also belonged to China. And then we have that.
And then we have a dog that's just randomly just barking out there.
Goes at it, right.
Yeah.
Okay, now in 1613, something unique happens. It goes from the Ivan family to the Romanovs. Okay, now the Romanovs, we all know as the last Tsar before the Bolsheviks took over.
Yep.
And so his great-great-grandfather was the first to create a national council elects Michael Romanov as Tsar, ending a long period of instability and foreign intervention. Romanov dynasty rules Russia in 1917 revolution. So, 1613 to 1917, this is 304 years that they reigned. Okay, so Michael Romanov, the great-grandfather of, oh God, what's his name now? Of the last Tsar. I'll get to the name later.
Yeah.
I think it's Alexander Romanov, but I could be wrong. Is named the next Tsar, and therefore creating the dynasty of the Romanovs. So in 1689 to 1725, Peter the Great introduces far-reaching reforms, including a regular conscript army and navy, subordinating the Orthodox Church to himself, and reorganizing government structures along European lines. So now he's in charge of the church. Now he's a god. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
And he actually creates a military that is, not just called out for militias, but a standing military, which was very important in those days, especially as your borders started expanding.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So in 1721, Russia acquires territory of modern Estonia and Latvia after decades of war with Sweden. So apparently that region was controlled by Sweden. Okay. Establishing naval presence in the Baltic Sea and window on Europe. Now, in modern days today, throughout the Soviet Union, the Baltic Sea was a crucial area. It's near the Crimea, okay? And they have bases, like they have naval bases in that area. And I know, if I remember correctly, the Russian 7th Fleet is there, even to this day. And it's been an area that's been disputed in modern times, and but it's an important key strategic naval area for the Russian government.
Yeah.
Okay? Or the Russian Empire, I should say. All right, so we're moving to 1772 through 1814. Russia conquers the Crimea, okay, Ukraine, Georgia, and what later became Belarus, which is my grandfather's, Moldova, as well as parts of Poland. And I feel bad for Poland throughout history because it was always this fight between Russia and Germany for Poland. And the word is, or they used to say, when the wind changed direction is what was happening to Poland. You know what I mean? At one point Russia's here taking conquest, and then you have East Germany, or Prussia at the time, also fighting for Poland.
Prussia?
Prussia, which is east. Prussia was a kingdom in northern Germany, also known as a military state. And believe it or not, Prussia, I don't want to go too much into German history, but Prussia dominated most of the 13 kingdoms of Germany before it became united under Bismarck. And the Prussian state was all military. And that's where the modern German military, before the war ended, World War II, they got their standards from the Prussian Empire.
Okay.
Even the military look and everything, it was all Prussian.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Okay, so having said that, poor Poland, was always kind of under the guise or the control of either Germany or Russia.
Yep.
We're going to move to 1798 through 1815. Russia takes part in the European coalition against revolutionary and Napoleonic France. Okay. Defeating Napoleon's invasion in 1812 and contributing to his overthrow. Now, I'm very familiar with this particular time in Russian and French history.
Yeah.
And at the time, Napoleon became an emperor of France, and he did something that Hitler would do it later on. He went into Russia without proper equipment and, without properly confronting the Russian winter.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't have to fight the people because nature will take care of it. And that's one thing that the Russians have had for thousands of years.
All right.
Is that winter, And, so army officers return home bringing liberal ideas from Europe, spurring efforts to rein in the Romanov autocracy. And that was not looked upon very well. And
right.
It went all the way into the Stalin regime. Okay. But we'll get to that a little later.
It's funny. I used to think that the word regime was pronounced regime.
Regime, yeah, that's fine. But yeah, so all of a sudden you have this new thinking in Russia. There's, these new influences from Europe, France, probably England, and so on and so forth. Yep. Italy. Mm-hmm. So free thinking, not allowed in Russia. And that was under the Tsar and under communism. All right. So in 1825, abortive attempts by liberal army officers to establish constitutional governments crushed in Decembrist revolt. So there was a revolt by officers of the army. I see him. Charlie's in the view.
Not the view.
In the view.
Oh, in the view.
Of the screen. Look at me, doing all this hand stuff.
I'm going to get you started on the view.
Yeah, don't do that. So, of course, it wasn't the first time that a army corps, the corps of the officer corps of any nation, turned on its own government. But apparently this one was really bad, and it wasn't the first time this would happen throughout Russian history. Alright, so Russia faces determined resistance in 1834 through 59 to their bid to annex the North Caucasus. Now, the Caucasus was, I think it's further south in Russia. Stop it. So they basically invaded and took and annexed North Caucasus. In 1853 through 57, Russia suffers setbacks in attempt to seize territory from declining Ottoman Empire through its defeat in Crimea, in the Crimea War.
Okay.
So we know who the Ottomans are. Not where you just rest your leg,
Right.
It's an actual empire, and it was Turkey.
Okay.
The Turkish Empire. Okay, so in 1861, which is like kind of around the time before the U.S. Civil War, okay, Emancipation Edicts ends serfdom, but keeps peasants tied to the land through continuing labor obligations. Rapid industrialization leads to growth of a small working class and the spread of revolutionary ideas. Okay, so we're talking 1861. Serfdom was basically another form of slavery.
Yeah.
Okay, and so the Russian government or the Russian Empire decided, listen, we can't do this to these poor people, but we will have a clause that keeps them tied to landowners. Okay, and a lot of that was happening in Europe anyway. You know, it's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
All right, so 1864 through 1865, the Kazakh steppes and Central Asian Muslim states annexed. So like Kazakhstan and you know, all these other stan was in the region, you know, ended up being annexed by the Russian Empire. 1877 through 78, Russian-Turkish War sees Russia seized land from Ottoman Empire in the Caucasus and established client states in the Balkans. It's funny how they say client states. Basically, they're almost like commonwealths, you know. 1897, Marxist Socialist Democratic Party founded. And in 1903, split into Menshevik and more radical Bolshevik factions. So it sounds like there was two different factions that came out of this, you know, Russian socialist and or Marxist. Now Karl Marx, his name was actually a German, and he wrote this he wrote all this stuff about governments and economic ideas and like communes, where everyone was equal. And his ideas were okay, but they were a little off when it comes to running a country. Okay, and therefore, after the revolution, you had the Bolshevik movement, and then it became communist.
Okay.
You know, and we'll get to that in just a minute. 1904 through 1905, Russian expansion into Manchuria leads to war with Japan. Okay. In 1905, revolution was which forced Tsar Nicholas II, that's who it was, Nicholas, to grant a constitution and establish a parliament known as the Duma. So that's Congress to us. The parliament is like a Congress. Of course, it was kind of governed by the Tsar, if you know, so it wasn't exactly a free Congress or a free Duma. In 1609 through 1911, constitutional rule is tempered by authoritarian government of Peter Stolypin, whose attempts to reform land ownership were only partly successful. Tempered by... Okay. Alright, so if that doesn't make any sense, I apologize. In 1914, Russian-Austrian rivalry in Balkans contributes to outbreak of World War I, in which Russia fought alongside of Britain and France, and later on the Americans. But by 1915, the Russians were taken out of the equation, and there was a good reason for that. And now to more modern history. Okay, the rise of the Soviet Union.
The rise of the Soviet Union.
And it says here, Lenin, who masterminded the Bolshevik takeover of power in Russia.
Every time you say Bolshevik, it sounds
bullshit. Yeah.
It sounds like you're about to say that.
No, the Bolshevik movement. Bolshevik.
The Bolshevik movement.
Bullshit. And in 1917, March, poor performance in the war and mismanagement of the economy at home prompted mutinies in the armed forces and street disturbances in major city. Now, this isn't in this information, but I did read a while ago that the reason why Lenin was as successful as he was, and why it helped him overthrow the Tsar in 1917, was because it was an actual operation of the German Empire, and in 1915 he was infiltrated into Ukraine. And from Ukraine, he started, doing his thing with communism, and he spread the word, and it became infectious throughout, because there were so many people unhappy with the Tsar, but it was funded by the German Empire. and it was a secret operation.
Right.
So he was so successful that he actually took the Tsar right out of the equation, and they took the government away from the Tsar, and they killed the entire family, the Romanov family.
Right.
Okay. But it, so in March of 1917, liberal leaders forced Tsar Nicholas to abdicate. Now, liberal leaders were like people like Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin. Stalin was one of the groups that were involved in the overthrow of the empire.
Okay.
So liberal leaders forced Tsar Nicholas to abdicate. A series of provisional governments seek to continue war against Germany despite disintegrating military and unrest at home. So yeah. So what was happening is, it's no different from what happened recently, like in the 90s when Russia became, or Soviet Union became no more. It created instability, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the Bolsheviks took over that. In November, Bolsheviks overthrew provisional government, suppressed elected constituent assemblies, established ruthless dictatorship of the proletarians, under Communist Party rule that crushed religion and political dissent. And the religion factor came from the Marxist ideology, because Karl Marx believed that religion was the opium of the masses. That's how he described it. Okay. So in 1918, which is the year the war ended, and World War I ended, Treaty of Brest and Litovsk end war with Germany at a price of major territorial losses in Eastern Europe and the Baltics, which are steadily recovered over following 30 years. So the Russians lost quite a bit of territory, and then, as you said, it was recovered within 30 years. So from 1918 through 22, Bolsheviks win civil war against White Russians, and it's not the drink. The White Russians were loyalists.
White
they were
White
the royalists.
Russian is a drink?
Oh yeah, it's actually not a bad drink, but I'm not going to get into details. But it's called, there was a White Russian and a Black Russian.
Okay.
So the White Russians are destroyed, which is kind of funny because they were aided by Britain, France, Japan, and the U.S. defeat in war with Poland and Soviet expansion westward until the Second World War. So apparently the Bolsheviks defeated them, but did not gain any new territory. Okay. Stalin's ascendant. So in 1922, a Bolshevik reorganized remnant of Russian Empire as Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, and so that's when they got the name the USSR. Or in Russian terms, when you look at the Russian letters, it looks like CCCP. Okay. And if you ever want to look at that, go ahead. 1920s experiment with market mechanisms and private business under new economic policies give way to state-run command economies under Joseph Stalin, who becomes virtually unchallenged as a dictator in 1929. So Stalin took over the entire party. And here's the funny thing is, to reference to what I just said, there was Lenin and then there was Trotsky. Okay? And after Lenin died, Trotsky went into hiding. And Stalin was third in line. So if I remember correctly, I believe that Trotsky was hiding out somewhere in South America. Okay? And the goons from Stalin ended up finding him and they killed him. Now mind you, this is the second man in charge of the Bolshevik movement.
Okay.
And he's actually destroyed by the third guy. Stalin was just a ruthless person. And so, yeah, Trotsky's dead. No more potential opposition or revolt. And he has his reign which lasted till, I believe, 1957.
Okay.
Okay. All right, 1930s, a very sad time for Ukraine. Stalin carries out a second revolution. Let me go back, I'm sorry. Social permissiveness and relatively generous approach to minority nationalities gradually yield to a conservative and Russocentric policies. So you go from these liberal ideas to like this really stern belief. Okay. So in 1930, Stalin carries out a second revolution to consolidate his powers, concentrating land ownership in massive state-run holdings, forcing the pace of industrialization, and killing his enemies, real and imagined, in the party, economic management, civil service, military, and security services. So Stalin had this horrible habit of having these. He was really, how do you say? He was really paranoid as a person. Okay, and so what he did is on occasion, he cleaned house. And in 1938, he actually destroyed. Literally, all officers were killed.
Jeez.
Yeah. And that's part of the reason why the Russians weren't able to respond to the Nazi invasion as fast. Because in 1938, you killed your entire officer corps, you got to rebuild it. And they weren't ready by the time the Nazis showed up. So they were behind, so they didn't have the leadership to actually deal with the Nazi threat.
Right.
Economic disruption and deliberate policy of repression leads to massive famine in Ukraine and deportation of hundreds of thousands of people to work in huge network of forced labor camps, usually in remote and harsh parts of the country. And when I hear that, I think of the Gulag. Famous word, famous name for a location in Siberia. And people, often only 10% of people that went in came out. They were no different from concentration camps that you would end up seeing in the Nazi regime. Okay, I mean, they didn't have the sophistication, but they'd starve the people and work them to death. You know, I mean, dying is one way or the other. It doesn't matter. Okay, so in 1939, Stalin concludes non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, seizing Eastern Europe, Eastern Poland. Again, remember I told you about that?
Yeah.
Germany and Poland again, you know?
Yep.
Parts of Romania and Czechoslovakia, and then the Baltic states after the start of the Second World War. Okay? So, here's the thing. Stalin did this knowing he had a suspicion that his adversary, Adolf Hitler, would come in at some point. So by agreeing to this pact, he gave him about 2 years to try to prepare for the potential invasion. However, it was like a year and a half. Okay.
Element of surprise.
Oh yeah, and the Russian, the KGB, could see what was happening, but because there's a global idea behind this where Russian couldn't attack the Germans. Because then they would be preemptive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so and a lot of Russian politicians and the military, they were hoping this wasn't going to happen because Germany was a powerhouse by this point.
Yeah.
A military powerhouse. 1939 to 40, inconclusive winter war against Finland reveals poor state of Soviet armed forces. Okay. Prompting Stalin to build up military in expectation of eventual war with Germany. Just what I said. Because they're looking at this, okay, all this activity is going on in Poland and Czechoslovakia and all these other areas, they're going to come for us. Because Hitler, he called Russia das Lebensraum, which means the living space.
Okay.
Okay. And Russia, being as big as it was, how are we doing on time here?
We got just over 5 minutes.
Okay. We're going to have to do episode 2 on this one. Okay?
Part 2.
Part 2, yeah.
Russia history part 2?
Yep.
Okay.
We'll have to do that next week, and I'll finish up then.
Okay.
So, Russia was such a big place. They had oil, they had grain, They had infrastructures for building more military equipment. They had the people. And Hitler's idea behind that was to enslave the Russian people. Okay? And, I mean, the Ukraine was already there. You know what I mean? It's all that was happening. All right, let's get a few more minutes in here. All right, so 1941, Soviet Union left reeling by surprise German attack in July. German advance only halted on the outskirts of Moscow. So they went like quite a bit. I think it was like over 800 miles.
Okay.
From Belarus, past Poland into Belarus, all the way to Moscow. And they did that in the first, I want to say, they got stopped, I believe, in September.
Okay.
So that was that's what they call a blitzkrieg, okay? And, in December. They arrived in Moscow in December. Soviet Union forms alliance with Britain and the United States, who provided it with military supply throughout the rest of the war. The U.S. had a really big part in keeping the Russians going.
Okay.
And one of the famous, and we're going to end it at here, one of the famous things about the U.S. involvement is not only were they sending tanks and rifles and MREs like sea rations and all kinds of grains from the United States to keep them going, but they also, the most famous thing they sent to them, spam.
Like
you know what
the
spam
food?
is? Yeah, the food. It never went bad. It was easily carried by troops.
Yep, they were sending him a bunch of emails, no.
Oh no, don't. Yeah, spam used to mean something completely different. But yeah, and that it actually made history because there was the summer or the winter of '43 was known as spam that saved the Russian military.
Okay.
And the Americans sent you can make it out of anything. It's like almost like C4, It's very pliable, and you can eat it raw, or you can eat it, bake it.
It's good.
Oh, I liked it. I've had spam
sandwiches
sandwiches
too. I thought it was just like bologna or something.
Yeah, it's pretty much what it is.
I had it, and then they're like, "No, it's not bologna. It's spam." I'm like, "Well, it's good."
Yeah, spam's not bad, but it pretty much saved the Russian army from starvation.
Right.
As I said, it was easily carried. If you had a loaf of bread, if you were lucky,
Yeah, right.
But even without the loaf of bread, you still had nourishment.
And you still had to cut it yourself because we didn't have sliced bread way back then.
Yep. Now, 1942, we got a minute or two.
Yep.
Soviet military steadily pushes back German forces after Battle of Stalingrad, which was known as the bloodiest battle in World War II. You know what I mean? Because they said about over nearly 4 million people died in just that one campaign.
Right.
And 2 million of those were Germans. And Hitler didn't care. He was sending them into the meat grinder.
Yeah.
Okay. And neither did Stalin. They were both crazies. All right, last one. 1945, Allied victory over Nazi Germany, followed by swift establishment of Soviet hegemony, which I don't know what that means, in Central and Eastern Europe and Balkans. So what happened once the Germans went all the way to Berlin is they quickly moved towards these other areas to secure them and to kind of like say we're in charge. That's the simplest way of saying it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. The annexation of 1939 and 40 are retained. Client governments are formed elsewhere, and parts of Germany and Austria are occupied. Stalin extends policy of heavy industrialization into these areas. So East Germany and parts of Austria were controlled by the Russians at this point.
Yeah.
Okay. And that leads us to the Cold War, and that's where we stop.
All right. So you guys heard the man. Next week we'll be doing Russia Part 2. The history of Russia is such a big country that it'll take 2 episodes.
Yep. Such a big history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So, thank you for listening tonight, and we'll be back next week with Part 2 of World History, Russia.
Ciao.
Bye.